You're lying in the dark, listening to your heartbeat. Now imagine this. You just married a woman, only to marry a man that same night. Sounds like fiction. It wasn't. This was real life in ancient Rome. Here's a truth most people don't know. Roman marriage was never about love. A husband cheating, perfectly normal. The wife, expected to stay silent, even when the affairs involved both men and women. I've studied over 200 ancient Roman records, and what you're about to hear is never taught in school. You'll discover why powerful men preferred playing the bride, how same-sex weddings were held openly, and the hidden world of seaside villas drenched in wealth, lust, and secrets. Take Emperor Nero. He married a young male slave, wore a bridal veil, and called him his empress. That wasn't scandal. It was ceremony. If you still think Rome was all togas and gladiators, skip this video and miss the most seductive, twisted side of one of history's greatest empires. In ancient Rome, love didn't mean roses or forever after. Marriage was a battlefield, but not for hearts. It was for bloodlines, property, alliances. Your bride, chosen by your father. Your feelings, utterly irrelevant. And your loyalty, let's just say it wasn't expected to lie in your own bed. The Roman Empire, golden and glorious from a distance, was a spider's web of power plays, spun in silk sheets. Husbands weren't just unfaithful, they were expected to be. Fidelity, in this strange world, was a concept reserved for women. For men, lust was another form of strategy. They loved women. They loved men. They loved boys. They loved whoever didn't threaten their control. But here's the part that might pull you up from your pillow. The scandal wasn't what you did, it was how you did it. Because to the Romans, the shame wasn't in the act, it was in the role. To be the dominant one was power? To be the passive? That could ruin you. Now imagine marble halls echoing with whispers, perfumed letters exchanged at dawn, statues carved not of gods, but of favorite lovers. Some emperors had wives, others had husbands, some had both. Some even married their slaves in full ceremony, veils and all. And then there was Nero, emperor, performer, bride. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's rewind to the scent of burning oil lamps, the hush of velvet behind closed doors, the young boy standing too close to a king, the emperor watching from a balcony with eyes that saw everything and gave nothing away. Because before the madness, there was method, and before there was a myth, there was a boy. Antinous, a name whispered like perfume, the one who drowned in the Nile, or was drowned. His death, an open wound. His memory, carved in marble. His lover, the most powerful man in the world. Just then, the sound of your own breath might shift. It's no accident. The Romans didn't just rewrite history. They seduced it. A lover became a god. A slave became a spouse. A crime became legacy. Somewhere between lust and leadership, between myth and memory, lies the truth of these impossible men. These emperors who ruled not only with laws, but with longing. And no, you haven't heard the worst. In the stillness of the imperial villas, beyond the curtains and down the hidden staircases, the most disturbing stories weren't told. They were lived. Boys taken not to school, but to serve in pleasure gardens. Men made gods, then destroyed. A mother rumored to share her son's bed, not out of love, but out of power. There's a reason history forgot to tell you this, because it's not just scandal. It's not just sex. It's what happens when power eats everything in its path, even affection. So tonight, as your room gets quieter and the shadows stretch longer, you'll walk with me down the corridor of 1,000 candles, where emperors whisper in dead tongues, where statues remember better than the living, and where love, strange, twisted, brutal love, waits at the center of it all. Don't close your eyes just yet, because what happens next is not what you think. It starts with silence, the kind that sits heavy on the air like incense in a temple, the kind that makes you think something sacred is about to begin, or something forbidden is about to unfold. In ancient Rome, there was rarely a clear line between the two. You see, this wasn't a world built on love. It was built on deals, bloodlines, legacies. A kiss could seal a marriage, but it could also signal betrayal. And under those marble arches, where senators whispered and slaves walked without names, marriage wasn't about passion. It was about politics. You married a woman to solidify your standing. You courted men, or boys, to solidify your power. They didn't even hide it. That's what'll catch you off guard. There were no affairs in shadowy backrooms, no secret rendezvous at midnight. Roman men paraded their lovers, male, female, in between. They had wives at home and boys on leashes, and as long as they played the game right, society didn't flinch. But if they slipped, if a man of stature ever let himself be used, not the user, his name might never recover. Because Rome didn't fear sex. It feared weakness. From the foreign to the farthest provinces, a Roman man's masculinity was his currency. Who he touched didn't matter. But how he touched, who he dominated, that was everything. The same man could father 5 children with his wife and be serenading a young male lover at night, and no one would blink, unless he gave up control. That's when the whispers started. That's when your statues got smaller, your name quieter. And it wasn't just the ordinary citizens. It climbed higher, into the palaces. Behind gilded doors, emperors, generals, and senators lived tangled lives that modern minds can barely process. Some loved gently, some took cruelly, and some turned desire into a weapon sharper than any sword. But there was a strange, glimmering exception to the rules. When a powerful man turned his gaze on a youth, in the practice called pederasty, age was the shield. A teenager, not yet a citizen, not yet a real man, was fair game. It was seen as educational, cultivational, a way to shape not just a lover, but a political heir. The older man gave mentorship. The younger gave beauty, admiration, and often, his body. It wasn't hidden. It was institutional. Some boys became stars in this strange system. One of them, Antonius, would become a god. But we're not there yet. In this empire, the idea of cheating didn't even exist the way we think of it. A man could sleep with anyone, prostitute, servant, neighbor's son, and still be considered faithful as long as he returned home in control. The wife? She was property. Her role was birth. Risking her life for another child was noble. Sparing her from it by seeking satisfaction elsewhere, practical, even considerate. And yet, even in this brutal clarity, even in this deeply gendered theater of roles, Rome found its contradictions. Some of its most powerful rulers dared to flip the script. Julius Caesar, yes, that Caesar, was mocked for his alleged willingness to take the female position in bed. His soldiers sang songs about it as he marched victorious through Gaul. They didn't hate him. They didn't even question his authority. They just couldn't forget it. Because a Roman man who ruled the world still wasn't safe from a good dirty lyric. And then, there was Hadrian. The wall, the beard, the philosopher king. But what they don't tell you is how deeply, how madly he loved. Not his wife. She was a political match. No, his heart belonged to Antoninus, a boy of grace and quiet intellect. Together they traveled the empire, whispering to each other beneath Egyptian stars, sharing books, glances, time. And then, one night, the river took him. A few minutes later, people started seeing statues, temples, coins with Antonius' face. A new god, born not of myth but of mourning. Hadrian built him a city. He built him a cult. He built him a place in history where love could be immortal, even if it had to be rewritten as divinity to survive. And just when it seemed like the madness had reached its peak, Rome gave us Nero. Nero didn't just flirt with scandal. He waltzed with it in silk. He married men, publicly. Sometimes he wore the veil. Sometimes he stood at the altar in full imperial regalia, binding himself to a former slave. And just when his people tried to look away, he made them watch. He castrated his boy bride to ensure the image of masculine dominance wasn't disturbed. And yet, somehow, he still wept for him like a groom denied a honeymoon. If you're starting to feel like you're trapped in a dream, half gorgeous, half grotesque, good. That's exactly what Rome was. And no matter how far we travel in this story, you should know one thing. We are not going to leave the shadows, because the darker the truth, the deeper the memory. Rome may be ruins now, but these stories, they haven't crumbled. They echo, in stone, in books, in that eerie stillness just before dawn. And we haven't even reached the island of Capri, where the windows didn't open, where the boys didn't speak, where Tiberius waited, alone, watching, wanting. But that's for next time. For now, hold this one thought as you drift further. Love is never pure. Not here, not in this city, not when gods could be made from grief, not when an emperor could marry a boy and a lie in the same breath. And the truth never made it out of Rome alive. They appear slowly, like silhouettes behind the curtain of history, not as facts or footnotes, but as figures stepping onto a stage, cloaked in silk and shadow, and each one carries with them something more than just a name. They carry contradiction. They are emperors, lovers, legends, and they are about to become your company in the night. First, he enters with a grin that history never quite wiped clean. Julius Caesar, the man who conquered Gaul, stared down Pompey and played God with the Republic. His legend has been polished, chiseled into marble, said in Latin. But beneath the laurel crown was something Rome could never quite ignore. They sang about him in the streets, not as a warrior, as a woman, as a man who, in the court of the king of Bithynia, let himself be touched, not as a Roman, but as a beloved. They called him the Queen of Bithynia, and though he denied it his entire life, the stain was too delicious for Rome to forget, because no matter how many battles he won, Caesar had once, maybe just once, been on his knees for power of another kind. Then, with footsteps lighter than air and eyes, like quiet storms, comes Antinius. You wouldn't hear him coming, you'd feel it. A presence, soft but impossible to ignore. A boy, they said. Beautiful, educated, chosen, not by fate but by Hadrian, Emperor of Rome. The bearded ruler, scholar-soldier, master of an empire too vast to tame. Hadrian loved Antinius not like a man loves a conquest, but like a god loves a prayer. They traveled together, dined, studied, kissed behind curtains. No scandal, not then. Only admiration, only awe. Until the river. Until Antinius slipped, or was pushed, into the black mouth of the Nile and never surfaced. And Hadrian, he didn't mourn. He built cities, statues, coins, cults. He didn't bury Antinius. He deified him. That's how deep the ache went. But before the scent of lilies could fade, the air turns rancid, because next comes Nero. He doesn't walk in. He storms. Perfumed, powdered, dressed like a bride in one scene, a god in another. A man who made Rome burn while he played the lyre. But it wasn't the flames that shocked the city. It was the weddings. 2 of them. Both to men. One to a freedman named Pythagoras. Nero wore the veil. The other to a boy named Sporus, barely old enough to be called anything but child. This time, Nero played the groom. But only after Sporus was castrated, reshaped, renamed. So the illusion would hold. So Nero could have a wife who wouldn't ruin the image. The cruelty didn't stop there. Whispers say he treated Sporus like a doll, paraded him in public, kissed him in front of the Senate, and beat him behind closed doors. Whether out of madness, guilt, or both, Nero would eventually force Sporus to reenact the death of his first wife. By dressing her body double in the same clothes, repeating the same words, then watching her die all over again. And still, Rome said nothing, because the stage was always full, and Nero wasn't the worst. From the mist rises another figure, colder, more silent, Tiberius, the emperor who left Rome behind for the island of Capri. At first, they called it retreat. Later, they whispered the truth, that on that island, behind stone walls and blue waters, something darker festered. They say he brought boys to his villa, that they were taught not to speak, only to please, that the emperor liked to watch, to command, to break. Roman historians, already suspicious, painted him as a monster, children trained to swim between his legs, perform in obscene plays, suffer in silence. Some of it may be exaggerated, but not all. There's always truth in rot, and you begin to wonder, was there ever love at all? Not yet, because they weren't done. These men, Caesar, Hadrian, Nero, Tiberius, they were Rome's sons. They were Rome's sons, made by a world that thought dominance was divine. That taught boys their worth through who they could command, and girls theirs through who they could bear. Where love wasn't sweet, it was strategic. Where sex was never just sex, it was spectacle, hierarchy, survival. To love was to risk. A few scrolls suggest Nero's mother, Agrippina the Younger, didn't just mold her son's path to the throne. She shared his bed. Suetonius claims it. Tacitus dances around it. The truth? No one knows. But in Rome, the more forbidden the rumor, the more eagerly it spread. She may have done it to control him. He may have done it to defy her. Or perhaps the story was born only after her death. An insult sharpened into myth. A final act of vengeance from senators who hated them both. Yet, the detail lingers. It hovers. Because in a world where nothing is too obscene to be true, silence is never innocence. And that's the company you keep now. You lie with emperors. You walk beside gods. You witness boys turned into offerings, love turned into law, and Rome, eternal Rome, turning passion into politics. But even now, there's someone waiting in the wings. Not a lover, not a ruler, but someone who watched it all and dared to speak. Someone whose words survived when cities fell. And their truth will burn longer than any empire. Rome didn't teach boys to fall in love. It taught them to inherit land, to command legions, to calculate loyalty like it was coin. And if they were lucky, if their blood was old enough, or their father ruthless enough, they were promised not to someone they wanted, but to someone they needed. Marriage was strategy dressed as ceremony. The vows were written in legal terms. The kisses, performed like theater. You didn't marry a person. You married a future. And love, if it showed up at all, arrived late, quiet, and usually in the wrong bed. Imagine standing in your tunic at 15, next to a girl you've never touched, in a hall filled with senators, drinking too loudly and whispering too much. Your father is smiling, but not at you. At the man across the room, the one who now owes him a favor. This is your wedding. And tonight, while your bride trembles in the dark waiting to be useful, you will climb into another bed. Not hers. His. A poet. A slave. A soldier. Someone who won't ask questions. Someone who won't complicate the bloodline. Because in Rome, a man's appetite was not a sin, only his softness. This is where the play begins, and where the curtain never quite falls. Power. Real power. Wasn't loud. It slid between fingers like oil. It hung in the way you stood, how you looked at a man, and whether he flinched, even in love, especially in love. A Roman man could take anyone to his bed, but never let himself be taken. To be penetrated was to be exposed. To be exposed was to be unmade. It wasn't about gender. It wasn't about dominance, about status. And so, boys were trained early. Dominate or be dominated. There was no third option. No freedom in passion. No safety in affection. A few minutes later, the rules sharpen. Boys of noble houses were not merely sons. They were currency. Offered, paraded, examined like livestock, but draped in silk. You learned to bow with grace, to speak with restraint, to yield without appearing submissive. And sometimes, yielding was expected, especially when an older man, powerful and patient, chose you. The relationship was called pederasty, but it was more than just sexual. It was mentorship, it was investment, and it was as common as inheritance. The older man, your patron, would guide your education, your fashion, your place in society. In return, you gave him access, not just to your mind, but to everything else. Antonius knew this world. He stepped into it with all the grace of a sacrificial lamb dressed for dinner. When Hadrian noticed him, the boy didn't run. He bowed, slowly, perfectly, as he'd been taught. Hadrian was the emperor of the known world, but that night, in that room, Antonius was more powerful, because Hadrian didn't just want a boy, he wanted this boy. And want, in Rome, was a vulnerability best hidden beneath armor. But Hadrian didn't hide. He took Antinius to his side. As long as they didn't love too openly, it should have been harmless, beautiful even, until the river. But we're not there yet. Let's step backward into another chamber, colder, darker, with heavier walls. Because while some boys were groomed to be companions, others were selected for more specific pleasures. And not all men waited for them to grow up. Nero didn't. Tiberius didn't. In villas far from the capital, boys were trained not with books, but with obedience. They were renamed, recostumed, repurposed, their pain ignored, their youth rewritten as invitation. And while Rome's laws forbade nothing outright, the Senate knew. They always knew. But who accuses the sun for burning too bright? In the middle of all this, you realize something. The empire wasn't built by generals. It was built by quiet agreements, by stolen glances, by boys forced to smile when they wanted to scream. Behind every marble statue is a boy who couldn't say no. Behind every emperor's crown, a dozen beds where dominance was rehearsed like a military drill. And yet, desire didn't die. It hid, in poems, in paintings, in letters burned before morning. And when it did surface, it shimmered, just for a moment, before Rome crushed it back into silence. Act I doesn't end in blood. It ends in perfume, in whispers behind heavy curtains, in a boy holding a goblet too large for his hands. It ends in a promise that looks nothing like love but feels, just for a second, like the real thing, until the next name is called, and the next boy takes his place. It was the quiet things that revealed them. A glance held a second too long across the marble courtyard. The way Hadrian's hand lingered on Antinius' shoulder, not like a father or a patron, but like someone who no longer believed in boundaries. In Rome, words were public currency. But gestures, they were private revolutions. And in the eyes of the empire, Hadrian was staging one, not with armies, not with policy, but with intimacy. Antinius was no longer just a boy. He had become a presence. Always one step behind Hadrian, but never out of reach. At dinners, their chairs were too close. At temples, their eyes met during the incense. At night, no one asked, because no one wanted the answer. The emperor was allowed desire, but not vulnerability. And Antinius made him vulnerable in a way no senator ever could. That was the danger. That was the beauty. The people adored Antinius. At first, he was young, educated, respectful, a Greek boy with Roman manners. He could discuss Plato with philosophers and charm the wives of governors. But beneath the admiration was unease. No official title, no military career, no family name worth engraving, just a face too perfect, and a silence that begged to be broken. Rumors bloomed like night-blooming flowers, soft, poisonous, inevitable. Still, Hadrian didn't care. He took Antinius with him to the far edges of the empire, across lands soaked in myth and power, through Greece, where the gods once touched boys like him without shame, through Syria, where prophecy could be bought and betrayal tasted like honey, and finally, to Egypt, land of the Nile, land of ancient rites and whispered sacrifices. Something changed there. Antinius' eyes, once eager, now searched shadows. Hadrian, usually composed, grew restless. The nights became colder, the wine stronger. One evening, they attended a ritual along the riverbank. The priests chanted. Torches flickered like dying stars. Antinius stood by the water, his face lit by the flame and the moon, and something else, something unreadable. No one knows what he saw or what he understood. But the next morning, he was gone. They said he drowned. But bodies tell stories, and his didn't. Hadrian was shattered, but emperors don't shatter in public. So he built a statue, a shrine, a god. Cities were named after Antinius. Coins bore his face. Cults were founded where his memory could live beyond questions. He was no longer a boy. He was marble, eternal, cold, untouchable. And then, just as Rome began to mourn with him, the whisper returned. This time, it was not soft. A priest spoke, too drunk to be careful. He said the sacrifice had been chosen, that the Nile does not take, it accepts. That Antinius had been offered to ensure Hadrian's fate would turn. A deal made not in love, but in desperation. Because the stars had turned against the emperor. And what is a boy compared to destiny? The story spread, of blood, of ritual. Some say Antinous jumped. Some say he was pushed. Others say he walked into the water of his own will, smiling, because the gods had already promised him something no man could give. And Hadrian, he never spoke of the moment again, but grief clung to him like ash. He wandered through temples half built in Antinous' honor. He issued decrees with hands that shook. And at night, when the servants thought he slept, they said he whispered one name over and over. Not as a god, not as a martyr, just as a boy. Meanwhile, in the heart of Rome, another man staged his own theater, Nero. But his performance wasn't one of loss. It was one of appetite. Where Hadrian built shrines, Nero built weddings. He married men in public, paraded them in gowns, crowned them empress, and declared their beauty law. When people murmured, he laughed. When the Senate protested, he threatened, because Nero didn't want to be loved. He wanted to be worshipped. His boy bride, Sporus, was just a child when Nero had him castrated. Not for cruelty, but for narrative. Nero needed him to fit a role. A replacement for a wife he had murdered. A mirror. A ghost. A reminder of what power could resurrect. Sporus wore the jewelry of the dead. Ate from plates once kissed by lips, now silent. And when Nero kissed him, it wasn't affection. It was proof that he could take what he destroyed and make it kneel. For a while, Sporus smiled, because survival sometimes wears a mask more convincing than love. But in the palace, nothing stayed beautiful for long. Nero's rage grew like mold, slow, silent, and then all at once, the boy stopped laughing. The boy stopped speaking, and in the dark corridors, he was just another shadow. One the emperor refused to let go of, even as Rome itself began to slip away. That's the part they never tell you. That behind every ritual, every marriage, every shrine, was a boy who didn't choose, and a man who mistook possession for devotion. But the story doesn't end here, because someone else is watching now. And what he does next will make everything that came before look merciful. The island doesn't welcome, it swallows. Capri sits in the sea like a predator that forgot how to swim, stone teeth jutting into the sky, its cliffs sharp enough to slice the horizon. When Tiberius came here, it wasn't as emperor, it was as shadow. He didn't leave Rome, he fled it. Fled the Senate's stares, the crowd's mutters, the statues that looked too much like judgment. Here, there were no eyes, only water, only silence, only boys. At first, the island breathed luxury. White columns, terraces dripping with roses, wine poured into marble basins, servants moving like ghosts through the corridors. But the deeper you walked, the colder it became. The rooms darkened, curtains thickened, locks turned not to keep thieves out, but to keep secrets in. Tiberius watched everything, from balconies, from behind curtains, from within himself. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Power had already rotted him from the inside, but it made him patient. His guests were young, too young. Some were told they were being educated. Others were bought. Still others were taken. They arrived with wide eyes and left without names. And no one spoke of them again. The stories bled from the walls, one by one. That Tiberius made them swim like fish between his legs. That he trained them to perform obscene pantomimes for his amusement. That he kept rooms of boys trained to pleasure, punished for anything less than perfection. Roman historians claimed it all, sometimes too eagerly, perhaps exaggerating. But when the same story repeats with too much detail, too much fear, it no longer feels like fiction. It feels like something else, something damp, something breathing. But here's what they don't teach. Tiberius wasn't always a monster. He was once a boy too, pressed into duty, into marriage, into exile, pushed by mothers, hated by stepfathers, adored by crowds he never trusted. Rome made him emperor, but never made him safe. And so when he built his palace on Capri, he built it like a fortress for a man who never stopped feeling cornered. And what do cornered men do? They become the very thing they feared. Some say he never touched a sword again, that his only weapons were silence and invitation, that he left bloodless scars on those who crossed his marble floors. He didn't rule with fear, he let it bloom on its own, like mold. Meanwhile, in Rome the city burned, not with fire but with rumor. Nero had returned to his performances. He sang in the theater while senators plotted in the back rows. His empire was cracking, not from rebellion, from disbelief, from weariness, from too many weddings, too many screams in the night, too many boys dressed like girls, too many girls thrown aside like broken wine cups. And then, he went further. In one performance, Nero reenacted the death of a goddess, forcing Sporus to play the victim. Draped in gold, painted in sorrow, before an audience too shocked to breathe, he acted out the murder of his own wife. And when Sporus sobbed, whether by command or by memory, the audience clapped, because clapping was safer than silence. Tiberius heard none of this. He had already buried his name. But Rome remembered. Rome always remembers. It began to whisper his legacy into Nero's ears. "You will become like him," they said. And he began to fear not being emperor, but being forgotten. And then, just like that, Rome turned. They called him tyrant, laughed at his poetry, mocked his marriages. His palace became a prison, his audience a mob. And in those final days, he turned not to generals, not to gods, but to Sporus, the one who never spoke, the one who never left, the one who never left. And when Nero held the dagger to his own throat, it was Sporus who stood beside him. But Nero couldn't do it, so he begged someone else to drive it in. And as his blood spilled on the floor, somewhere far away, a forgotten room on Capri echoed with nothing. No footsteps, no screams, just a breeze, just the sound of something ending. But Rome wasn't finished, because the boy never stopped appearing. Not Sporus, not Antinius, but the boy, the idea of him, the one who's taken, tamed, taught to love by men who never meant to be gentle. He returns in the next emperor's chamber, in the next shrine, in the next scandal written in ink that won't fade, because the empire may fall. The names may change, but the story never really ends. They always say the empire fell from the outside. Barbarians, borders, chaos, chaos. But no one talks about what cracked inside. Not walls, people, men who were never told no, boys who were never asked if they wanted any of this. Rome didn't die with a scream. It sighed, slow and exhausted, as if even it had grown tired of pretending its decadence was strength. It starts with Antinius. His body never returned from the Nile. There was no funeral, no tomb. Just silence. Then coins, then temples, then a city built on the name of a boy who never ruled anything. You can still feel it, this strangeness, how love turned into godhood, how grief became monument. But no one dared ask what Hadrian traded for it, because there's a part of the story no one puts in the records. That the Nile doesn't drown men without a price. That blood seals power in a way politics never could. So what did Hadrian give? Or worse, what did he allow? And that's where the rot starts to smell. The boy who drowned is still worshipped. The man who mourned him is called great. But no one lights candles for the ones who didn't make it to marble. The boys in Capri, the ones who played brides in Nero's parades. The ones who stopped speaking, stopped crying, stopped being anything but decoration. They disappear not with ceremony, but with the turning of a door handle, the scrape of a sandal on stone. And somewhere, deep inside the empire, someone learns. Survival means smiling at the right time, and bleeding where no one can see. Then comes the final break. Sporus, now alone, now free in name only, carries Nero's ashes in a tiny urn. The empire shudders but doesn't stop. It absorbs tragedy the way old wood absorbs smoke, slowly but permanently. A few years later, Sporus takes his own life. No note, no protest, just one last silence. After years of being told his voice was not his own. And that silence? That's the real collapse. Not when Rome's buildings crumble, but when the ones trapped inside decide there's no reason to scream anymore. And Tiberius? By then he's already a myth, a stain on stone. His villa left behind, but never emptied. The sea still crashes there. The caves still echo. There are rumors, always, that some of the rooms were sealed off forever. That not everything inside was dead when they closed the doors. But none of this, none of it, compares to the quiet horror that rises in whispers decades later. A scroll, a letter, a report written by a senator who never quite believed the story of Agrippina and her son, who wondered How a mother might control an emperor, not through politics, but through affection, and whether Nero's first wound wasn't betrayal, but intimacy that crossed a line too sacred to name. Because maybe the first thing Nero ever learned about love was that it binds, that it takes, that sometimes the person who gives it to you also makes you into something else, something useful, something loyal, something broken. And maybe that's the point. That in Rome, love was never just love. It was always something with teeth. Even the gods learned that the hard way. They came down for boys, for beauty, for worship, and sometimes they never made it back up. So you ask, what's left? Not the names. Most are lost or rewritten. Not the laws. They changed with every emperor. Not the cities. Even they crumble. What remains is the shape of the wound, the pattern, the way power always finds a body to wear, and how the body, if it resists, is simply replaced, painted, forgotten, until someone lights a lamp too late at night, and a face in the stone looks back. Maybe the most dangerous thing in Rome wasn't the dagger, or the poison, or the whispered plot in the Senate after sunset. Maybe the sharpest weapon was desire, unchecked, unnamed, dressed in silk, dripping with incense, hidden behind the heavy doors of palaces where no one ever knocked. Maybe that's what truly undid the empire. Not the war, not the barbarians, but the simple fact that power never learned how to love without turning it into conquest. And the truth is, that part hasn't changed much. We still build gods out of longing. We still carve beauty into stone and forget the face behind it. We still pretend control is affection. We still silence the ones who don't fit the script. Only now, instead of marble, we use filters. Instead of shrines, we have screens. Instead of emperors, we have algorithms. But the story? It's the same. A boy is chosen. A man is praised. The middle part, what happens between them, is quietly edited out. Rome wasn't special because it was cruel. It was special because it made cruelty elegant. You could walk its streets and never see blood, just roses, perfumes, poetry. But if you looked closer, if you listened past the harp music and the speeches, you'd find the broken teeth behind every smile, the boys behind every victory, the bodies beneath every statue. And maybe that's what stays with you the most. That in the end, it wasn't just one emperor or one scandal. It was the pattern, the repetition, the way each generation learned nothing and forgot everything. They called it destiny. They called it destiny. They called it Rome. But really, it was just repetition with better architecture. So maybe the lesson isn't to mourn the fall of the empire. Maybe the lesson is this. If you want to know who really held the power in Rome, don't look at the throne. Look at who wasn't allowed to speak. Look at who was rewritten after they were gone. Look at who became a statue, not because they were remembered, but because it was safer than letting them stay human. And the next time you hear a love story, one told in gold, in history books, in clean Latin, ask yourself what was traded for it. Ask yourself who disappeared when the curtain fell. Because the show always ends the same. Someone claps, someone bleeds, and someone always is forgotten. Until someone else, maybe you, finally decides not to look away. Sometimes the past isn't something we study, it's something we carry. It lingers in the way we love, in what we're told to hide, in who we're allowed to be when no one's watching. What happened behind palace walls centuries ago may feel far away, sealed in marble and myth, but if you listen closely, you'll realize the echoes are still with us. History doesn't just record the deeds of the powerful, it records their blind spots, their silences, and perhaps more than anything, it preserves their patterns, not to trap us in them, but to show us the cost of forgetting. Because what happened in an empire of gods and gold wasn't just scandal, it was a mirror. One that dared to show the cruelty of control disguised as care. One that forced us to question whether the ability to possess is ever the same as the right to love. Love, when used rightly, liberates. But love twisted by power binds, breaks, reshapes people into roles they never chose. And that's a story not unique to one empire. It's the story of every place where affection is expected to bow to hierarchy, where tenderness is taught to wear a mask, where vulnerability is punished instead of protected. The real tragedy is not that these things happened long ago, but that they still happen, quietly, repeatedly, behind different doors, under new names, with the same aching cost. Yet there's something gently powerful in remembering, in telling the full story, in choosing not to flinch even when the details bruise. Because when we dare to remember with honesty, we give dignity back to those who were never allowed to keep it. We let the silence speak, and maybe, just maybe, we learn how to build something softer than empire. So tonight, as your room dims and your thoughts drift, carry this with you, that even in the darkest corners of history, there were moments of real tenderness, fleeting, fragile, yes, but real. And if we let those moments matter, if we see them not as shadows but as seeds, perhaps we grow into a world where no one's love has to hide. Thank you for walking with me through this strange, heavy, human journey. If this story moved you, stayed with you, or made you see something differently, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know, what stayed with you most? What do you think history still hasn't told us? And if you want to be part of more journeys like this, deep, dramatic, and a little haunting, go ahead and subscribe, turn on notifications, and join me again next time. Because the past isn't finished with us, and neither is the story.